Hello, I'm Frank Ohlhorst, editor-at-large with Channel Futures. Today we're going to talk about the hidden opportunities of GDPR. My guest today with me is Sue Bickell with Susan Bickell Consulting. Sue has extensive experience setting up retail and compliance solutions for, large Fortune 1000 companies and other size companies, and has become somewhat of an expert on GDPR. Thanks for joining us today, Sue.
Thank you, Frank. Glad to join you.
It's great to have you here. What I've been seeing out there is that the e-tailers and retailers at large have been very focused on resolving the issues around GDPR, getting ready for it. I mean, it is right around the corner. That said, I think there's a whole nother segment of industries that are going to be impacted by GDPR that probably aren't either fully aware of it or even are ready for the impact because they haven't observed how deep GDPR goes. How do you feel about that? Are you seeing kind of the same thing?
Yeah, I agree with you, Frank. I really think that there's been a lot of attention given for e-tailers and retailers to be compliant with GDPR, and I think many of them are aware of the deadlines and are working towards compliance. But in some of the other areas, it's maybe not quite as obvious in those other industry segments that GDPR is a real and important initiative that they're going to have to be compliant with, and some pretty strict regulations out there and fees for non-compliance.
Sounds to me like there's not only a challenge for folks out there providing consulting services, but also a pretty big opportunity. What business segments are you seeing that are going to be impacted by GDPR that perhaps have not gotten the full message yet?
So I think the first one probably is in the colleges and universities. So I've seen some of the bigger colleges and universities starting to make a move towards ensuring that they are compliant with it. But there is an opportunity, I think, for a lot of help to be given to some of the other colleges and universities out there. I mean, EU citizens and their kids, they want to send their kids to this country to experience what life is like here in the United States. And get the education opportunities that are available out there for some of our colleges and universities. So some of the big ones are, have programs to try to get students in from the EU, and so they're capturing their data, and that's EU citizens' data that's being captured for purposes of admissions. And then once the students are actually in the college or university, their information is there. So that counts towards the number of records that can be kept to the total that would make them potentially in scope for GDPR as well. So I think you're right, a lot of opportunity there for colleges and universities to get some help in both recognizing that they're in scope for it if they capture that kind of data, and then becoming compliant.
I don't think people realize how many citizens of the EU attend college in the U.S. I think they'd be surprised to discover that, actually.
Yeah, I mean, there's probably a significant number out there, especially for the bigger colleges and universities and the more renowned ones that have programs and scope. I think there's a pretty big market for that out there, and there's a pretty low threshold for compliance as well. So even some of the more mid-sized and possibly even a smaller one, if there's a specialty area that they focus on that gets them a lot of EU citizens or residents, then they're going to fall under that category to be compliant.
And even if that EU citizen is here under a student visa, they're still kind of bound by the GDPR because they're still a citizen of the EU. Isn't that kind of correct?
Right. It's the way I read the regulation. It says citizens or residents, permanent residents of the EU. So even if they're here on a student visa, I would think that they would be compliant. But again, they'd have to reach out to their own legal counsel to find out whether or not they're in scope for that. But I have seen some movement in some of the bigger colleges and universities to become compliant for GDPR. So some of them have certainly already determined that they are in scope for that, and then they're working towards compliance.
Okay, excellent, excellent. What other businesses do you see being impacted by the forthcoming GDPR requirements?
So another big one, it seems to me, would be within the travel industry, because there again, airlines, cruise ships, et cetera, they'd have to capture the information for the people who are using their services, who are traveling. I mean, certainly these days you can't buy an airline ticket without providing your name and your contact details and proof of that that you are who you say you are when you go to board the plane or the cruise ship. So that's capturing the very information that is in scope for GDPR. So the travel industry is another one. I mean, people in the EU that are traveling into this country and using domestic carriers, whether they're doing it for pleasure or for business. And I can even see, a businessman or woman who is working in this country who has to travel from one location to another using one of the domestic carriers here in the United States. And having their information in their systems, again, that counts towards the number, and there is a limit, and once you exceed that limit as an organization, you're in scope for GDPR, so people in the travel industry should be thinking about it as well.
So, I mean, that would even include, let's say you have an EU citizen that is a temporary resident in the U.S. and they're using domestic carriers, or say they're going on a cruise or something like that. Being as their data has to be recorded, it means that business providing those services could fall under GDPR requirements.
Right, exactly. I mean, it's again, it's a number of records that you capture, number of people. And it's for anyone who's an EU citizen. It's to protect their data. So it spans the scope. It's beyond the EU. So here in the United States, any of the companies, including in the travel industry, that are capturing that information, if they reach that threshold, they would have to provide the right level of protection, et cetera, of that information and the right auditability to be compliant with the GDPR standard.
So you've brought up both education and travel as two additional areas that service providers might have to focus on to meet GDPR requirements. Does any other industry come to mind?
The third one that would come to mind to me, and this is probably the last one that I can think of off the top of my head, would be anyone who's doing any kind of international shipping as well. So if it's if a company is doing shipping internationally from the United States, again, a US-based company, they might be shipping to citizens of the EU, either who live in the EU or who live elsewhere, but retain their citizenship for the EU. That would also be another potential industry that should be considering the implications of GDPR, whether or not that's something that applies to them, and then making themselves compliant by the deadline if they determine themselves to be in scope for GDPR.
Wow, that could be a significant number of businesses with all of the importers and exporters out there that deal with bringing stuff in and out of Europe. I mean, odds are that their end customer is a citizen of the EU.
Right, and again, even if that citizen is not having the goods shipped to the EU, they might just be a citizen of the EU and having it shipped to themselves here as their temporary resident or residents or elsewhere. If they are citizens, that puts them into that mix of people. And when the business exceeds that number of people, then they become in scope for GDPR compliance, and they have to meet the requirements of the GDPR regulation. So yeah, I think there's a pretty significant impact across a number of different businesses beyond just retail and e-tail.
Wow, very good, very interesting. I think that that's information a lot of the MSPs and other types of service providers should take to heart out there if they're servicing any of these businesses, that maybe they should start thinking about addressing the GDPR issue and making sure that their customers are aware of that before this deadline hits.
Right. I mean, awareness is obviously the first step because, again, as we talked about, GDPR is very much in the discussion and dialogue for retail. But some of these other business areas, industries, I don't think really have given it thought and realized that they could be in scope for GDPR if they meet the thresholds that are established there. So MSPs who are out there who have the opportunity to help their clients, first to be informed of the fact that this is there, then maybe to establish whether or not their clients are in scope or not in scope, and then help them to reach compliance is very important. Because you know, the fees are very high for non-compliance in GDPR. So a lot of companies who could be in compliance should do everything in their power to make themselves compliant in time so that they're not getting hit with these extra costs that could be very significant to their business and have a real impact to them.
Wow, very interesting. I want to thank you for your time, Sue, and I'm going to include in the some of the text surrounding this interview information on how folks might be able to contact you if they have other questions about GDPR or need help in getting things set up. Is that okay with you, Sue?
Yep, that's great. I'd be glad to help. Thanks a lot. Really appreciate it. Anybody who needs it, please reach out to me.
Okay. Talk about putting you on the spot there, right?
Okay.
Once again, I want to thank you for your time, and I want to thank those that have watched our interview here. And once again, this is Frank Ohlhorst, editor-at-large with Channel Futures, and my guest today was Sue Bickell. Thank you very much. Take care.